Hello, folks. This is episode 1 of Conversations with Hector. I'm Hector Bordas, and today we have Alexandria Bordas. And yes, she is my niece, and she's very much a person just like you and me. We're going to learn a lot about Allie, how she became a journalist, what inspires her, her higher power, the challenges that she faced regarding her story about a mayor in the California wine region, her view on life, and what makes Allie truly beautiful. So join me in this first episode. Hello, this is Conversations with Hector, and I'm Hector, and I get to dive deep into the lives of people like you and me. And today we have an amazing special person that I hope to get to know even better after we have a nice little conversation. Allie Bordas. Allie, you have the same last name as me. How did that happen?
That would be because I'm your niece. So, believe it or not, everybody, we are related with the same last name.
Isn't that amazing? What a coincidence. How does that happen in life?
Wild times. I don't even know.
So your dad is my brother, Anthony, and Joanna's your mom. I heard that they're out having fun in some crazy part of the world. What are they doing?
They are currently road tripping through Italy. So clearly I'm very jealous because I'm still in my living room where I'm always at working while they are eating pizza and drinking wine.
Wait. They're in Italy eating pizza? I mean, you can have that here.
It's Italian pizza, the special kind.
It's not Domino's, Pizza Hut. I mean, they're getting something special.
Just top notch, made by like an ancestral recipe passed down to every grandma ever.
That's fantastic. Well, Allie, you and I, over the past, I don't know how many years, I think we have some interesting, fun conversations. And I got to know you, and maybe you got to know a little bit about me. I'm just hoping that today we dive a little deeper, see what's happening, see what you can share and I can share. So you said you're in your living room. Where is your living room?
My living room is in Oakland in the East Bay of Northern California. And I moved here, God, right at the start of the pandemic, actually in early 2020, thinking that I was going to get to know Oakland and the Bay Area. And then I've just really gotten to know my living room and the lake really well, which is where I just would walk every day.
Oh, so why Oakland? How did you get there?
Yeah, so I've been a journalist for working in newsrooms across the country for going on 10 plus years at this point. So like aging myself.
Wow.
I know. And my most recent newsroom before the pandemic was in Santa Rosa in Sonoma County of Northern California. And once I left that newsroom, I ended up taking a job for the first time in a really long time outside of newsrooms in a nonprofit organization where I got to use like my journalism skills, but in a totally new way, which was working with students, like mostly female middle and high school students that wanted to learn how to create their own films and find their voice. So it was really awesome for me that had been finding my voice in the writing world to give it back to middle and high school students that were really excited about storytelling, but didn't really know how to tell a story. So that organization was located in Oakland, which is what eventually made me move there.
So, okay, I definitely want to hit that part of your life with the nonprofit and then working with females and helping them kind of explore their stories. I think that sounds fascinating. Like Santa Rosa, I know there's an amazing story there. What's going on? There's a little bit of controversy.
Yeah, there is. Yeah, which I am totally willing and open to dive into. It's a massive part of my life and put me on a trajectory I never expected. But I came to Santa Rosa in 2018 from a newspaper where I was working in North Carolina. So I was at a small paper there and just was doing the traditional climb that we are always pushed to do in our capitalist society, which is climb the ladder step by step. And so I went from a relatively small newsroom to like a middle-sized newsroom in Santa Rosa, and very quickly realized it was going to be a very high-paced, pretty aggressive work environment with an all-male editing staff, which like a lot of industries, although it's changing, but in newsrooms, there are traditionally a lot of men in positions of power and editing. And I had only worked for men at that point anyway, so that wasn't really any different. But this was the first time that I was challenged in a way that made me felt like it was potentially because of my gender or concerns that I wouldn't be able to handle sometimes some of the grittier, more serious, hard-hitting topics that would sometimes get passed to my male colleagues, or I would just be second-guessed in a way that I had never faced before in other newsrooms. And so that started to weigh on me within the first 6 months of my job, because I, at the time, not anymore, but at the time was a yes person. I never had boundaries around saying no to assignments or to work. I never thought I would be allowed to have boundaries because I was chasing my career, and I thought that you had to constantly make concessions for that, including your mental health or your happiness outside the workplace. So I would always say yes to any and every story, any and every assignment, even if that meant that I'd been working since 9 a.m. and was there until 10 p.m. It didn't even cross my mind that I could potentially put a boundary down. So after 6 months of doing that and still feeling like I was trying to prove myself to people that didn't even care if I succeeded at that, is when I started to get disillusioned by the industry for the first time. And that eventually, started me towards wondering whether there is a space for me in this industry anymore. Is this fulfilling? Am I even helping the communities that I promised to serve if we're moving at such a fast pace and we're not being intentional? So that's when the larger philosophical questions about journalism started kicking in, was my time in Santa Rosa.
There's a lot there. I mean, you brought up a lot of different issues that I bet a lot of people are facing, and they get themselves into a situation. They have to make a decision which way they're going to go in their life. So which one you want to tackle first? You mentioned capitalist society. You mentioned you're working in a male dominated industry, which there's quite a few out there, and that is changing over time. What kind of intrigues you the most right now of all those different things?
I think for me, it's what I would love to be able to discuss more here would be, despite going through what we all sometimes go through in the workplace, this rat race of proving ourselves, of not having boundaries, of thinking that if I just push it a little bit harder, I will get the respect and get the freedom and the autonomy I need to do what really makes me excited. I really like exploring that angle, coupled with realizing when it's time to step away and heal and stay true to yourself, because that's ultimately what led me to get to the position I am in now, which gives me the autonomy to pursue what I believe in.
So what made you the switch? I mean, wanting to prove yourself. What happened?
Yeah, so this was 2019, so I had been at the paper since about November of 2018. So in springtime of 2019, I had been working in a really small community in Northern California. That was what's called in journalism, it's called your beat assignment. So usually every journalist gets a beat, and that could be something as broad as homelessness or the environment and climate change or education, or it could be something much more specific like City Hall or covering one specific town in a county. And so at the time I had two beats. I was covering healthcare in Sonoma County, and I was also covering the small town of Windsor, which is only a town of less than 30,000 people, but at the time had a new mayor who came in. He was a young guy who was also a winery owner, and he was looking to put his town on the map. He wanted to elevate it to a new wine country destination. So Windsor took on a new level of interest with my newspaper because there was this surge of youth happening that the town hadn't seen before. So I volunteered myself to cover the town because, like I said, I was just going to say yes to everything and volunteer to cover everything because I wanted to be number one, and I'm very competitive.
Yes.
So I started covering the town of Windsor in January 2019, and over the first 6 months of that year, I came to find some really troubling information about this new mayor. I had developed a lot of trusted sources at that time and had made connections with the community members that were really had a pulse on what was happening. So I knew I could trust them to tell me what was really going on. And they started pointing me in the direction of some concerning rumors about the behavior of this young mayor. And ultimately, that unfolded to me pitching this story to my editors and them asking me to stop pursuing it and to kill it. And the story was too troubling for me at the time to both stay at a newspaper that didn't want to stand behind these accusers and also stay at a newspaper that would silence that and silence my ability to do something that I felt was really important and could ultimately like stop pain that was happening.
So what decision did you make? Because, you it sounded like you had a job there, you were getting some stories, and then at the same time, they were throwing these roadblocks at you. What did you do? What decision did you make?
It was really hard. And I think, looking back now, like where I am now, much more confident, much more able to walk away or say no to things that aren't really serving my higher purpose. Looking back now, I'm like, I should have walked away probably a long time ago. But it took me a bit longer to kind of reach that bottom level where you just hit rock bottom and realize, wow, this is not only damaging me as a journalist and me as a person trying to grow like a backbone and strength in myself. This decision is also damaging a wider community of people. The harm element was actually more terrifying to me. So, long story short, the real thrust of the story was this new mayor had some troubling sexual assault allegations made against him, against a few women living in the community. And the newspaper decided not to stand behind the story and ultimately not stand behind the women. And this was at a time, only a few years ago where the Me Too movement was at the height. So the fact that the newspaper decided not to back this, they missed a massive story in their own backyard, which eventually came and bit them in the ass. But like at the time, they didn't see that. And at the time, it felt like they were not just saying no to me as a journalist, they were in a larger philosophical sense saying they didn't believe the women. And that ultimately is what led me to completely leave an industry that I had invested both so much of my own money in by like paying for grad school, but also just so much of my passion. So it was the hardest decision to walk away, but I felt like I could no longer, almost like the Hippocratic oath that doctors take. You don't take a formal journalistic oath, but there is a moral compass to it, and I felt like mine was being compromised. So I left in the summer of 2019 and vowed to do whatever it took to get that story published somewhere else.
Okay. Yeah, the story's pretty amazing, and I'm sure people can look it up. So I don't want to, go into the story, but I want to know more about you and the challenges of getting the story out there. And you mentioned this moral compass and higher purpose. What is that? What's there?
I mean, that could be an entirely other podcast that we could do, or like you could we could have a whole panel discussion about it. Like why, like from what age or what influences us to feel connected to some sort of moral obligation. And I don't know if it was it's this unofficial journalistic oath almost that I took when I decided to go in this industry, that I am not my story. I am like a vessel for people to get their stories out there. Like I'm a medium, like almost like, I mean, it's exactly what you're doing now. You're giving me the platform to share. So it was these women, these three women that I initially started with, built up the trust with me and took the incredibly courageous steps to share some of the most traumatic experiences of their life. Yeah. I didn't have a choice, it felt like, at that point. There was only one way forward for me, and it was do whatever it takes to find a home for these stories. Like, regardless of what the outcome was going to be, I was basically entrusted. It's just like, it's a sensitive amount of information, and what was I supposed to just like move on with my life? There was no moving on with my life after hearing that. There was one way forward, and that was keep chipping away at it and eventually find a publication that was going to be courageous enough to run it.
Yeah. So that brings up so many questions, because where you're at now, and then you were driven to get the story out there, and something was pushing you. I mean, how do you turn that away? You have these women entrusting you with this information, and it'll be a disservice to them if you didn't step up. I mean, but going back in your life, I mean, of course I know your dad and your mom. So what drove you to journalism? Because I know my family, and I don't know if this is the right word. We consider traditional careers, doctor, dentist, lawyer, and then here's Allie, a journalist, which is phenomenal. I mean, that you actually you're this free spirit that went seeking some truth out there or something. But what inspired you? I mean, what was it?
Yeah. So you're the first person that's gonna know this, which is interesting. I'm gonna say it here first, but the first paragraph of every cover letter I've ever written for a job starts with our Cuban family. It's really interesting. Yeah, I've never shared that before, so that was a great question. It's the reason I fell in love with storytelling was because of our family and listening to the stories. I mean, more than anybody, especially Poppy, who, are my grandfather and Hector's father, who unfortunately recently passed. I mean, ever since I was as young as I can remember, I got to hear these like really incredible stories about growing up in Cuba and this farm in Cuba. And I loved getting to hear about a land that I hadn't gone to, and also the courageousness of realizing when it was time to leave, and the steps that it took to start over, and the challenges that it took to get there, and also learning about corruption and the system that led to that moment. It is from a young age that I just remember, like, of course I loved playing as a child, but I valued those times at the holidays where I got to hear stories from my family that I had never heard before. So I think I just fell in love with the storytelling and reading at a really young age. And then, the stories I was hearing in our Cuban family were so traumatic and big and powerful. Like, how could I not be moved to be like, well, that sucks. Why did that happen to my family? Like, why did my grandfather have to leave the only place he ever felt at home? And so I think when I started becoming more conscious and aware of my brain, I started realizing, like, well, there are systems and powers at play here that don't allow people to be happy, or don't allow people to have certain freedoms. And then as I got exposed to activism later in high school and college, I saw that, I did a lot of protesting. I did a lot of sit-ins. I was a organizer in a lot of these protests, but I often grew frustrated with the activist communities. There was always felt like a ceiling, or we weren't being taken seriously. And so I realized I could channel my passion for storytelling into an activist-centered career, and that actually journalism, like, as much as this might be an unpopular opinion, and as much as journalisms and newsroom institutions say they are completely unbiased, like, journalism drives change. We've seen it in Ukraine, like the exposure of we've gotten to see what's happening in Ukraine from the front lines because of courageous journalists that are in there, like shooting that and doing live video, just like the way we're able to see snapshots into like the devastating opioid crisis gripping the nation. It's because we have journalists going into these opioid dens and like figuring this out. I mean, the amount of activism that actually is the act of journalism makes total sense to me why I would be attracted to it. Even though journalists are unbiased and we don't aim for solutions, we just expose the truth, which is literally activism, but okay.
That's a phenomenal story. I mean, there's so interesting. I mean, it does drive change. I mean, your story and the mayor from Winston definitely drove change, and which is fantastic. And the success of this story, I mean, you can talk about that later, what it has brought to you. And just, I would imagine the reward of getting that published was amazing. But going back to your activists, I don't know if they call them roots or wherever they came from, whether it's from the stories of Cuba, was there a particular story about Cuba that kind of, pushed you in a certain direction? Something you recall?
Yeah, I think it's probably one of the stories I've heard almost most often, and that, you know, has changed the most over time depending on who's telling it and depending on how many details are being shared. But I think the one that really at least sparked that initial interest in, like, well, why does this happen to people, and, you know, what can we do about it, and what can I do about it as somebody who's first generation and privileged and didn't have to go through that, but, you know, my direct family members had to go through that. And I think it was just listening to the amount of courage and steadfastness that, you know, my grandfather, your father had in trying to keep the farm and fight for the farm that he grew up on. And that was so much a part of his family's history, and the horrifically painful decision to leave because at risk of losing his family and needing to get his family to a secure place. That is, to me, so graphic, traumatic, and courageous all at the same time. That is the heartbeat, I think, for me, of my journalism roots, was that story of getting ripped away from everything you knew and loved, that you would have never willingly left it, but making that very massive sacrificial decision on behalf of your family and turning away. Like, why does this happen? Like, why are the powers that be allowed to make that happen? That's how the questions started, like, kicking in for me.
Yeah, that's a fantastic story that I know well, and I experienced it because I lived through it, and I know the pain of all of that, and then the struggles of coming over. And what's amazing is it is the story of so many immigrants, so many, and Koreans, Vietnamese, Hispanics, you name it, and their struggles to come to the United States and to look for those opportunities where, you know, they can restart and grow and you know, and find some success however they define it. But there's so many stories out there, and they're gut-wrenching, and it would be so amazing to capture some of those, maybe on another podcast.
Yes, you should.
So then this story, I mean, I love that you share that. How's that shape your mind? And I'm going to use the word activist again, because that's not a bad word. It's not. It's a powerful word though, and where has that taken you? I mean, you mentioned you work with a nonprofit, and you were working with women there to get their stories. Did that shape you there or somewhere else?
Yeah, I think, you know, starting with the roots of our family, which, like you said, is the roots of so many displaced families in another country, and, you know, hearing about kind of the gratitude for being able to start a new chapter here, but the pain at having to leave in the first place, and, like, why does that have to happen, I think set me on that trajectory. And then when I was in college, undergraduate, is when the really big, like, DACA movement started happening. So a lot of my fellow students who were born, like, a lot of my fellow students at the time were born in Mexico or another Central or South American country. And although they eventually came to the US, they didn't have official citizenship yet because they were, like, kids when they came over. So although they were going to, like, graduate from college, there was this discrepancy on, like, whether that graduation certificate would even be merited or as equal to somebody who had full citizenship. So that actually was a really prevalent activist issue that was happening when I was at California State University at Fullerton between 2007 and 2011. And so that theme of immigration, like, came back up again, and kind of now I was seeing it in my peers that were, you know, really struggling with that. And so I started finding myself, like, being an ally to a lot of these movements in this same 4-year window in undergraduate, is when I was surrounded by a lot of queer folks that were, like, gender fluid and sexually fluid. And so I was seeing that for the first time, and the oppression that came from that. And so being exposed to that at a young age, I think, is really important, like, coming from somebody who is, like, incredibly white presenting and, you know, incredibly privileged in the fact that I didn't have to immigrate. I instead learned what it meant to be quiet and listen for the first time too, as well. Like really sit back and listen to these stories and then figure out how I could be of assistance and as an ally to them. And it oftentimes was sharing their stories or going out there and protesting with them. And so going up to when I started working at the nonprofit, it was a moment where I had just left journalism, never thinking I was going to go back. I was carrying these women's stories from Sonoma County in my back pocket, knowing eventually I would have to heal from that really traumatic time in the newsroom because I was going to have to figure out a way to tell their stories. So I was going to have to get over my own trauma with the newsroom. And it was really healing being in an environment where I was getting to nurture young voices in a healthy way. My voice wasn't always nurtured in a healthy way as a journalist. And it was fundamental, I think, to work with such young, especially female identifying or gender fluid students, to help them curate their voice in a way for issues that they wanted to help. And they are like such smart children. Like they know the issues incredibly well, especially issues surrounding climate change, which is obviously such a massive issue for this younger generation, which I think should reflect to all of us. But they just needed help in finding a way to tell their stories. And instead of telling them you're too young, you don't have the experience, I got to sit there and be like, okay, so how do we tell this story? Like, do you want it to be a fiction or a nonfiction? Do you want actors or do you want it to be your own voice with moving pictures? And it ended up helping me heal enough to find my voice again in order to tell these women's stories.
So they helped you heal.
They did. The youth of the nation helps me heal.
How did that feel?
I mean, it was massive. I couldn't have ended up going back into journalism to tell that story. I needed hope again, and I hadn't seen the positive side of storytelling in a while. I had lost kind of my way and lost my anchor and my guiding light for why I was doing it. And to see youthful excitement is really, really healing. To see like that passion and the fearlessness. I think it's the fearlessness when you're working with youth that really empowers you. Like they are not afraid to embarrass themselves or to ask the questions, and they are unafraid to try new techniques, and they're also unafraid to tell like very big stories for how small in stature they are.
It's funny that you're talking about the youth and I'm looking at you and you are the youth.
I know, but I'm 32. I'm a different generation of youth. Like, yes, I am like still on that young side, thank God. But we're talking about like the 13-year-olds, you know, that are half my age. Yeah. And they are that next generation of youth. And I'm like, oh my God.
So you're young. I mean, at least from my perspective, you're very young.
Thank you.
You know that. So interesting. So you hit so many different topics, and then you got your story published. So what's next for you? I mean, you mentioned climate change. You have mentioned other. I mean, I'm gonna call them sensitive because for some people, some of these topics are sensitive and require some good, healthy listening. I think that's important. But so what's next for you? Where are you going with all of this?
I mean, it's really a lot to process. Like 2021 was such a big year for me because like you just mentioned, the story published in April of last year, and that really ignited kind of this smaller Me Too movement up in Northern California. So like Northern California really hadn't had a Me Too movement yet. Like it had, you know, been participating in larger national conversations, but there wasn't something as big as this that kind of gripped Northern California. And I didn't realize that that's what my story was going to do. So it really opened up an additional almost year of reporting on it, which I thought it was going to be one story and then kind of just a reaction piece and that's it. But that was not the case. I ended up reporting dozens of investigative stories over last year. So come January of this year, those really big existential questions started hitting me because since 2019, I had felt very certain about what it was I was supposed to do was to get these women's stories out. And there was a lot of healing associated with that for me personally to get there. But I was certain of my direction and I was certain of what I was being called to do. Now I'm a little bit more fucking confused. So I'm like, oh shit, I don't know. So that is a great question. That is the question I've been asking myself every day for 4 months. What are you doing with your life now? What story should you be telling? I don't know. There's a lot of different things I'm interested in. I could definitely, there's some bigger stories in Northern California that I could be interested in sharing. I also sometimes do think about, whether it's time for me to leave the industry again and pursue something more in management again, where I get to go back to kind of nurturing younger voices, or maybe work in the field of communications, but in a more bolder, aggressive activist space, climate, like the ocean, something where I maybe feel like I don't have to be as unbiased. I could, or biased. Now I see I always get this confused. Unbiased. Unbiased. Something where I can share a little bit more of my passion and my feelings without totally, breaking the conversation space. But I'm definitely not tethered to just storytelling in the Bay Area. I think my passion and my interests extend beyond that. So it's definitely an exploratory phase. After something so huge, I don't know.
Yeah, I can imagine. What do you do now? I mean, it's like this dam just burst and it's out there, and you go, where's this river taking me to? Who knows?
I literally don't know. Is the question that has been plaguing my insomnia every night.
So plaguing your insomnia. What of all those things? I mean, what's pulling you? Is there anything particular, or you're still kind of just figuring it out?
I will say I really enjoyed actually working on that story during the 2 years before I ran, kind of as an outsider. I liked being a freelancer on it. I liked not being tied to the traditional newsroom and what comes with that. I actually really enjoyed getting to experience the best of both worlds, working at the nonprofit while also freelancing this story on the side. I think that if I look back over the last few years, that was probably when I felt at my most powerful and my most sure of myself. So I think I'm drifting, or I'm being called to potentially look at opportunities outside the realm of traditional newsrooms again, while pursuing freelancing on the side. I think that journalism for me personally, especially now, has become an incredibly emotionally demanding path that I think doing it full time, it really, really, at least for me, has energetically drained me. So I think my next chapter is I'm really seeking more of a balance where I can pick and choose how much I'm giving to a story, as opposed to being demanding that I have to do it every day because it's my job.
Wow. So it'll be awesome to do this again, to see where you're at and where you're going, and to learn more about all those different topics that you hit upon, because they're all so fascinating. I mean, it's just things that are up to the moment right now, things that are happening right now, which is quite fascinating. So I'm going to steal a line from one of my favorite podcasters, is Tim Ferriss. I'll give him 100% credit for this. He asks his guests all the time, if you had a billboard, hypothetical billboard, and you could write anything on it, what would you write on it?
Don't be afraid of other people's opinions.
Awesome. Fantastic. That's really good. That's really good. And you mentioned that you like to read. Is there any particular book that's your favorite? Or
oh my God, that's so hard because I read so many great books. I'm going to swivel. I'm looking at my bookshelf right now. Because
what are you reading now?
I just finished actually a really incredible book that's called The Madhouse at the End of the Earth. And it is about, it's actually really inspiring. And it's a true story about a group of explorers in the late 1800s who explored Antarctica for the first time. And their ship got trapped in the ice for an entire year. And they had to literally dig their way out or die.
Oh, that's sounds phenomenal story.
I mean, talk about perseverance and the will to live. I mean, and the delicateness of the human mind when left in darkness and isolation. That book was terrifying, but really, really great at the same time. I just finished it. It was really good.
Well, that's great. I love to read also. I got multiple books. I don't know which one to finish first. It's like there's so much.
I know. I have a whole book
Allie,
I was looking at.
Oh, very good. So you like physical books or what?
Physical books, and I recommend to everybody go get a library card because you'll save money. It's eco-friendly and it's really fun to go to your local library and support it. It's very cool. It's old school.
It is old school, but it's great. So Allie, this has been a lot of fun. It really has. Yeah. And I really appreciate you sharing your stories, and definitely want to do this again, and see where you're at, and see if your parents brought you anything back from Italy.
I'll have to keep you posted. Maybe a postcard or something.
Okay. So is there any last words you want to share? Any words of wisdom, anything important that you want to share before we go?
I just think for me, this is so commonplace, and we probably read it on every quotable book and postcard and sticker and magnet, but the reason I was able to get to the point I am now and even able to sit back and get to ask myself the big questions about what I want to do with my life is because I really believed in myself. And I think that is really difficult. My father, love him to death, obviously, but he was weary of the story. Even the people closest to you can sometimes, because they're concerned about you and your well-being, it came from a place of well-being, but sometimes even the people closest to you may not understand the reason you're sticking with something. And as long as you spend the time sitting with yourself and evaluating and reflecting about why you feel so compelled to see something through, at the end of the day, if you still are left with I have to do this, I am a full faith believer to just trust yourself.
Yeah, I mean that goes exactly what you said about the billboard, about other people's opinions, and sometimes you just have to hold fast, and you're doing the right thing for yourself, even though it's going to be incredibly challenging, and you're going to face so much opposition, but you had the belief in yourself that this is the right thing to do. Yes.
Thank you for having me on. This was so wonderful.
This was great, and I'm sure we're going to do this again, and let's see where we go.
Yes. Thank you so much.
Allie, thanks again for being on the show. Everyone, please hit the subscribe button. And you can always find me at Hector at onepluswe.com. And until later, take care. Goodbye.